managing the 619 Part B of IDEA. However, that sort of shortchanges her role in supporting collaborations between the State Education Agency and the Connecticut Office of Early Childhood. She's going to really focus on some of the state level strategies that they have implemented around creating greater coordination among and between state agencies. So she's coming to us from Connecticut. After we hear from Andrea, we will hear from Laura Zawinski, who is with the Texas Education Agency. She is the Interagency Deputy Director for Early Childhood. So by her title alone, you get the sense that she is deeply engaged in helping to facilitate agency to agency discussions and collaborations. And then we will close out the session hearing from Denver Public Schools and Jane Walsh, who is the Early Education Director for the district and has extensive history working at the city and school district level in supporting connections between the K-12 sector and community-based early childhood providers. So with that, Andrea, we're going to jump to you, and bear with me, don't get seasick. We're gonna have to jump through a couple of slides since we're changing up the order here. So Andrea, I'm gonna turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Christy. So I'm proud to be here today to represent the Connecticut State Department of Education and our experiences here in Connecticut with regard to transitions during COVID-19. So Christy, should I just ask you to change slides? Oh, next one, please. So we're small in Connecticut. We have 169 school districts, and it's about a 2-hour drive from north to south. We're a local control state, and we know that a collaborative approach resonates best with our LEAs and with our other education and community partners. To give you a little bit of background into the structures in Connecticut, the Connecticut State Department of Education has responsibility for pre-K-12 and public schools, and that includes special education. The Connecticut Office of Early Childhood, which is a separate agency from the State Department of Education, is Connecticut's Birth to 5 agency, and that agency includes licensing, state-funded preschool, as well as Part C, early intervention for infants and toddlers. The Connecticut Association of Schools is Connecticut's principal membership organization. And in Connecticut, we have regional education service centers, and we have a regional education service center alliance that has representation from all 6 of the regional education service centers, which we call RESCs, who each serve a geographic catchment area of the state with training and technical assistance as just one of their functions. In the area of early childhood, each state, each RESC has an early childhood lead, and the group works collaboratively with me on activities to support early childhood and IDEA. The area of collaboration that is typically the most unique for Connecticut is that we're one of the few states that has a completely separate agency for early childhood. As it pertains to transitions, this has a significant impact on Connecticut's transition, especially from Part C to Part B and the efforts that we make. Next slide. So the governor of Connecticut, Ned Lamont, issued an executive order this spring to authorize state funds to be used for a continuation of early intervention services over 3 for children who turned 3 during the time period when schools were not in regular session as a result of COVID-19. The Connecticut State Department of Education and the Connecticut Office of Early Childhood collaborated on guidance and had several webinars to provide clear guidance on the procedures, responsibilities, and limitations of over 3 early intervention services. The agencies were able to collaborate on efforts to ensure that children turning 3 during the pandemic who were not able to be assessed and have their eligibility determined did not fall between the cracks. This required a great deal of collaborative and technical assistance from both agencies, since, as I said before, Part C early intervention is located at the Office of Early Childhood, and where I work, Part B is in the Connecticut State Department of Education. We also provided a flow chart with clear pathways for decision-making for Part B and Part C with regard to early intervention over 3 as a result of COVID-19. And the flow chart was extremely helpful because, as all of you probably know, even when you provide a great deal of training and technical assistance, people need to have a very concrete document, especially when things are different the way they have been. Beth Bai, the Commissioner of the Office of Early Childhood, and Dr. Miguel Cardona, the Commissioner of the State Department of Education, have met regularly throughout the COVID emergency and have issued joint memos and guidance related to early childhood and in general, and specifically to preschool and kindergarten. There was a specific joint memo issued with regard to transition to kindergarten during COVID-19. The two agencies also encourage communication and strong relationships between public schools and community-based childcare, and both commissioners and agencies try to model this relationship as we go forward. Next slide. The joint memo about transition to kindergarten used Connecticut's ESSA student transition resources that were developed collaboratively between the Department of Education and the Office of Early Childhood with the support of the Ed Council in Washington, D.C. And this is all as a result of a technical assistance grant that continues to be ongoing. The memo reiterated the key components of successful transitions, including pre-transition activities, collaborations, core activities, and the importance of establishing timelines that are the guiding principles in the transition to kindergarten, the why, what, and how of this important milestone for Connecticut. And I'm assuming that the slides will be going out afterward, and there is a live link to that document. So it outlines best practices about why transitions are critical for continued success, and unpacks effective transitions by answering the following questions. Why are transitions important? What are the key components of successful transitions? And how can district and school leaders implement successful transitions? This document outlines critical pre-transition activities, necessary collaborations between providers, teachers, leaders, and families, and identifies core transition activities based on best practices. It also includes guidance on professional development opportunities, developing family partnerships, leveraging existing resources, and the key components of effective communication before, during, and after the pre-K to K transition. Next slide, please. The 5 core values in the transition to kindergarten, the why, what, and how of this important milestone for Connecticut students, are mirrored as the guiding principles in the joint memo from the Department of Ed and the Office of Early Childhood that the Commission has issued about transitioning to kindergarten during a public health emergency. The core values reflect the importance of relationships with families and family engagement, clear and ongoing communication, respect for diversity, and relationships between adults and children, and the need for knowledgeable staff. Next slide. This slide shows how the core values of the ESSA document were restated along with strategies and considerations surrounding a return to school, continued distance learning, and hybrid models. You can see in this example from the joint memo about how the guiding principle of collaborative, responsive, and trusting relationships with families was broken down into considerations for the various ways kindergarten may be implemented in the coming school year, with what should be common across all models, and then followed by considerations for a face-to-face return to school, a continuation of distance learning, or a hybrid model of face-to-face and distance learning. Next slide. LEAs were also referred to what parents should know about kindergarten entry, enrollment, and attendance document. This is a tool to help explain Connecticut's options for kindergarten enrollment, as school is not compulsory until age 7 in Connecticut, but is strongly encouraged. LEAs must offer kindergarten, and families may choose to send their child to kindergarten as long as they are 5 on or before January 1st. And I think Connecticut may have the distinction of having the youngest kindergartners in the country right now. So if they have to be 5 on or before January 1st of that school year. But families can opt to hold them out of formal schooling until age 7. Families historically have been confused about options like opting out of K and the implications that the decision can have across specific areas like access to special education services. Even more confusing as a result of COVID-19 is the difference between opting out versus distance learning versus homeschooling. And we've received a lot of inquiries about that. All of the documents I've mentioned are available on the Connecticut State Department of Education website. If you're interested in locating any of them, I've also provided the links in my slides, and you're more than welcome to contact me directly if you have any difficulty locating them. Next slide. Another COVID-19 related strategy for transition to kindergarten is our upcoming Leadership Roundtable that's actually scheduled for tomorrow morning. This Leadership Roundtable is a continuation of a 619 funded effort from the 1920 school year. In Connecticut, we know that many of our building level administrators don't have a formal background in early childhood, and sometimes they haven't had any coursework or experience regarding development of young children. In Connecticut, we do have a P3 leadership program through the University of Connecticut, but we needed a less intensive way to engage building leaders and help them with special considerations that are often necessary for our youngest learners in their buildings. The sessions last year were done regionally, and we had a strong response from several of the regions. As I began to revise our IDEA training and technical assistance with our Regional Education Service Center Alliance for the 2021 school year, and we decided that a continuation of the activity, we had already planned it, and what we decided was we were going to adapt it to meet building leaders' needs given our current circumstances. In Connecticut, the majority of preschool programs in public schools are implemented to provide a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And as you know, none of the requirements of IDEA have been waived. So we decided this was a good opportunity to support public school leaders in the area of early childhood. In addition to partnering with our RESC, our Regional Education Service Center Alliance, and the Office of Early Childhood, we decided that the Connecticut Principal Membership Organization, the Connecticut Association of Schools, would be an important partner in reaching building leaders. We'd always planned to have a session with them, but now we felt it was important to form a deeper partnership to support LEAs. As a result, we're having our roundtable conversation, as I mentioned, tomorrow morning, that currently has a registration in our teeny tiny little state of almost 400 participants. We invited building leaders and encouraged them to partner with other LEA early childhood staff. We were clear that principals should attend the roundtable with partners and not just send a partner on their behalf. The main focus of this session will be a panel discussion with community-based programs who have not closed and have remained open during the pandemic, as well as public school preschool programs who have reopened for the summer. The panel members are going to share their top strategies for the effective return to the physical classroom and face-to-face instruction, as well as answer questions from participants. As participants registered, they had an opportunity to send questions in ahead of the roundtable. And as a result, we made sure the panelists know what topics are of the most interest to the participants. And in general, the majority of the questions were related to health and safety. This session will be the kickoff for our monthly Early Childhood Principal Roundtable for the 2021 school year. All the participants will receive a survey immediately following the roundtable to get feedback about the session, to find out if they had questions that were not answered, and to find out if they're interested in participating in our upcoming monthly roundtable sessions. Depending on the number of principals that are interested, we may move back to those regional sessions to ensure smaller groups for a better opportunity for active engagement. And also, depending on the need of those participating, we may go to, as I said, regions, or we might go by the type of LEA, because we do have some interest in people having sort of affinity groups with the larger urban settings wanting to have conversations with other large urban districts, and these smaller, more rural or suburban districts wanting to have their conversations. But overall, our goal really is to have active engagement. We know that having 400 people on the webinar tomorrow really isn't going to allow for a lot of interactivity, but we also know that people are hitting their crisis mode. They want to have support on how to open, and they want to know the lessons learned from people who have been open or have opened already. So we decided that we had to weigh the interactivity with getting information out, and we decided it was more important to get the information out right now, and then we can go into smaller sessions. Last slide, please. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to share the work that we're doing in Connecticut around transitions and COVID-19. And feel free to reach out if you'd like any additional information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. And if you'll note in the chat box, we will be sending out both the slides as well as a recording of this session, so you will be able to access all of the links. And Andrea, thanks for helping us see the systems building that went on prior to the pandemic and how that really helped to set you up for, I don't even know if success exists right now, but at least for constructive strategies in the present. So thank you for that. We're now going to go from a very small state to a very large state and move to Texas, which has a whole lot more school districts and a whole lot more land mass. And Lauren, if you will unmute yourself, I will let you take over from here.
Great, thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm very excited and happy to kind of showcase a little bit of the Texas landscape, where we are, what we have as a state kind of realized and be able to stood up in response to this COVID pandemic, and how that has kind of shifted our reality and hopefully initiatives as we move forward. So keeping on this momentum of state agencies and kind of what Andrea nicely laid out for us in her state, taking this lens now with the spin on the interagency role, as I see here in Texas, as well as what we have accomplished thus far. So looking at, before we dig into this content that I want to share with you on the slides here, there's two pieces that we really have realized in recognition here to not only transitions for children, but just transition in general, meaning transition into this new reality. What will that look like as we transition into our next stage of reality? What does it look like transitioning for our students from one grade level to another, or one service to another? And what does it look like for our families transitioning from what was a normal scenario to this kind of new normal, to also many of them serving a dual role of parent/teacher? So we recognize in conversation that there's twofold here. One, this support for transitions and the supports we're giving our students, which I will get to in a moment, but also this relationships amongst adults. And the first layer to that is this relationship that we're seeing being built even stronger across our state agencies. Part of that is we are together needing to navigate these competing demands, and it's impossible to do so unless we have this type of collaboration and coordination amongst the state agencies. A part of that, of course, is this decrease in funding streams, but also this decrease due to budget cuts. And so how can we, the question then is raised, how do we continue our collaboration and efforts when there are not budget line items contributed to that? So you have to get inventive. Another piece of that is this number of questions and concerns raised from our families. As Christy mentioned, Texas is slightly a large state. We have over 1,300 local education agencies or school districts in our state, and about 5.5 million children in our public school system. So there's quite a few concerns and questions that arise from our community and families. So how do we go about addressing all of those? As a result, really, this idea of transition, this kind of underpinning theme of transition, aligned to this coordination across agencies and getting inventive. What some showcasing that innovation is across agencies. This thought through the public of not wanting to return to a public school setting, so we'll homeschool instead. And since I'm homeschooling, I might as well homeschool some neighbor or some family and friends. So this interagency collaboration coordinated and aligned our Texas Education Agency's homeschooling effort or division with our childcare licensing to help to identify and create a white paper to guide and facilitate conversations on decisions of homeschooling, and at what number, what hour, what magic point does it transition need to have childcare licensing involved for regulation. Another big aha out of Texas in this innovative kind of cross-agency, non-budget item, but want to contribute to navigating these new waters is a kind of health and wellness awareness with our families and our students, recognizing that oftentimes our time in which we have our kind of oversight to students is when they're in the classroom, and we might be lacking that. So we want to be able to provide some guidance to support that. So the Texas Education Agency issues some guidance to help us support that connection in remote learning, but then included our Department of Family and Protective Services, our prevention early intervention, so they could create parallel documents and supports for parents and families to help to inform practices and components that they should be looking for. The most recent development across agency is the Texas Education Agency's released efforts to promote and support remote learning in lieu of internet connection and device purchasing for students and families. And the Texas Workforce Commission has started to engage in collaborative conversations with that to see if there are ways in which we could utilize that initiative to help us support children in childcare and families who choose to place their child in a childcare setting over the traditional kind of school setting. And last but certainly not least, as it's been one of our most popular initiatives that have been able to stand up in response to this, is the Texas Childcare Availability Search Portal. This is definitely a cross-agency initiative. It looks like a hotels.com type availability portal in which you can, as a parent, visit the site, type in your zip code, and all available childcare programs near that zip code will appear, broken down by seats available per age group, whether they accept financial assistance or not, and if they are a QRIS rated program, as well as the childcare licensing number, so you can search their record. This has been extremely successful and very innovative and useful for the state. So there are already conversations on how we can sustain that moving forward and then expand it to provide even more resources, even more information like resources and referrals, as well as eligibility. So that then leads me from the kind of adult relationships and needing to be built to help to support transition just from service and to program across the state, to the actual resources that have been stood up to support transitions for our students. So we know our current reality is this, and Christy, you can go ahead and click forward for me. We know that we are experiencing great discrepancies across our state. We have a variety of challenges that our students are facing. We have teachers who are being asked to perform daunting tasks of taking a traditional environment and traditional setting and transitioning it to a fully remote access to our students and our families. And we also know that accessing technology itself is challenging and difficult. And we especially look at that in our young learners of our pre-K to second grade, and how that can be appropriate in remote instruction for these young learners, as well as our diverse learners. Next slide, please. In response to this, Texas has enlisted a great focus here on high quality instructional materials for pre-K, is the example I'm sharing with you here. We recognize that pre-K is a very unique grade level when it comes to the resources that we support in Texas. Unlike Connecticut, Texas has in our statute pre-K at age 4 through to the 12th grade. So as a result, we need to create some instructional materials and resources for remote learning for our students in pre-K. What we've provided to our education agencies in lieu of a support for kind of reflecting through your curriculum and your materials are that there are 4 key pieces that should be included and integrated into your material. Developmentally appropriate practices. The material itself includes supports for and adaptations for all of our diverse learners. There's an emphasis on some main content areas such as health and wellness, language and literacy, development and learning through play. And there's a strong emphasis on progress monitoring, both with the teacher interaction, but also progress monitoring that the family member or parent support at home can be able to provide and support. If you'll keep clicking for me, Christy, should be one more perfect. The idea is that as we reflect through when we look at and provide this guidance on these high quality instructional materials, that there's usability for both on-campus and remote settings. And that there are these additional supports that come out of this reflection process for families. A great example of this would be that if we were to provide guidance on adapting a learning center activity from the classroom to the home setting, we can't simply just ask a family member to provide a gross motor activity or a music and movement activity. We need to be able to provide some supports and resources to explain exactly what is meant by that guidance and what that would entail and why it's also important and developmentally appropriate. Helping our parents to understand this whole instructional feedback loop and developmentally appropriate practices that helps to help our students, regardless of the setting that they're in, receive that high quality instructional practice. Next slide. So the Texas Education Agency, in helping to support this transition for our school districts first, who will then support this transition for our students and families. We recognize that as we prepare for this remote learning, there will be one of 2 pathways. School districts will either A, adapt their current and existing curriculum so that it aligns to remote learning and helps to support students and families transitioning from their summer environment to this remote learning experience that will then support them transitioning back into what our new reality will be. Or there is this pathway of adopting new content. So as the education agency has released to schools, this is kind of the overarching broad thought process in which we are guiding our school districts to think through. First off, do your materials align to those high quality instructional components that we just discussed? And if so, and your response to that, you'll follow one of these 2 pathways. On the left in blue is the adapting pathway, and on the right in red is adopting pathway. So based on what you see and you've identified what would need to be adapted, on the left, what would need to be changed, kind of slightly adapted from what you currently have, and thus then the question, do you have the capacity, the allocation, the time needs to be able to do so? This, of course, is that big area that a lot of our districts are reflecting on. They understand that they can adapt some of the components to their pre-K curriculum and instructional materials, but do they have the staff, the manpower, the capacity in order to be able to do so? Or does it transition them over to the adopt something new? When we are looking at the adopt something new, this is when the Texas Education Agency, our next step into helping to support transition, comes into play. Christy, if you could. I apologize for the formatting of this in the copy and pasting over. It looks like our Texas version of slides did not like this new formatting. Here are some of the challenges that we are hearing from our districts that go with this adapt versus adopt and helping to support this transition into remote learning. This is a new atmosphere for all of us. So we're trying to do the best possible to help to support our districts in helping to navigate these uncharted territories. One of that biggest challenge that we hear that's supporting teachers, they need that time to optimize, to be able to engage with students, but then have that kind of one-on-one support. The challenge of wanting to adapt materials so that we can engage in high quality experiences at home, but do I actually have the time as teacher, considering it's beginning of August, to be able to adapt and change all of those instructional strategies before the actual start of the school year, or, as well as schools needing to rely on adults in these kind of strange, unprecedented times to be able to fully integrate these high quality experiences, wanting to make them as simple and straightforward for any adult support at home to be able to provide. Next slide, Christy. So this is the kind of response to helping to support that transition. We thought through, we identified through this adapt versus adopt thinking process to help schools to get to this point on where and what additional resources to engage in. The education agency is providing this Texas Home Learning 3.0. 1.0 was the quick response to the end of the spring and 1920 school year. 2.0 was that bridge of the summer gap and summer school support. 3.0 is this remote learning for the return to school for the 2021 year. There are 3 components that are here and available to support our local agencies in helping to transition students and families back to school. One is the curriculum, a pre-K to 12th grade digitized, standards-based, standards-aligned curriculum available to our school districts to adopt. A technology, a learning management or LMS system for our remote learning to function and interact with, as well as professional development, not only recognizing that this curriculum and the LMS will require professional development to our teachers and administrators, but our parents and our family supports at home will also need to receive professional development. Connecting back to this guidance on adapting versus adopting, should a school district recognize and identify that they need to adopt something new, they have this full package of support of curriculum, technology, and professional development where they can pick and choose components, pieces, all of them, or some of it to help to supplement their existing curriculum and plan for remote learning, helping to ease that transition for our students, for our families, as well as our local school districts, and really beginning and starting up this next 2021 school year.
Thank you, Lauren. I apologize for your slide formatting. In the world of Zoom bingo, if I had $1 for every time somebody said, oops, sorry about formatting, you're muted, I can't see you. So we're going to chalk that up to that. Now, if everyone will just close your eyes for 10 seconds so you don't get seasick, we're going to go back to the beginning of the presentation. Jane Walsh from Denver Public Schools was finally able to get into the session. We're now going to be shifting from this state level perspective on how they have been supporting transitions, broadly defined, both the transitions from early childhood into kindergarten, as well as this challenge of transitioning from what usual school looks like to what these different models for fall startup look like. We're now shifting to an LEA perspective. Jane Walsh is with Denver Public Schools here in my home state of Colorado. And so Jane, if you will unmute yourself, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Christy. Denver Public Schools is really glad to be able to be here and be part of this conversation. It's so important. It's been quite a journey and the end is nowhere in sight. So we are constantly in motion, striving to meet the needs of our families and our staff in our community. I want to give you a little background about Denver Public Schools. We have had early childhood programming in DPS since the mid-60s when Head Start was first established. And we serve over 5,000 3- and 4-year-olds in approximately 90 schools, and that includes our DPS charters. Our early education department has the belief that all of the young children in the city are ours, as most of them will ultimately attend DPS at some point in their schooling. Thanks to the state's Colorado preschool program, we're able to provide funding and support to 33 agencies who deliver quality ECE opportunities at over 50 sites across the city. This really increases the choices that families have in finding a program that meets their needs. Our early ed department staff provides a myriad of supports for schools and central office, as well as our community sites. We have multiple teams to accomplish the work on everything from internal nuts and bolts and cross-departmental initiatives to childcare licensing and monitoring for quality ratings and compliance. Additionally, we oversee 4 large early education schools that collectively serve about 1,000 children. Our team of 6 regional specialists provide professional development to all early childhood staff in the district. As you can see, we have over 800 teachers and paraprofessionals district-wide. ECE teachers hold teaching licenses as well as being qualified for childcare licensing requirements. Paraprofessionals must qualify for instructional paras. And we're somewhat unique in the state as all of our teachers are contracted at the same rate as our K-12 teachers. This is not the norm in Colorado, and I think in many early childhood settings. You can go to slide 2, please. Slide 3, just went through that, sorry.
Are you able to see it, Jane?
I am, I'm sorry, I'm having just a technical issue here. There I go. So that's our background. How does that impact now where we are in COVID pandemic, which required us to shift to remote learning for ECE students and their families? So from mid-March through the end of the school year, we had children doing remote learning in various settings, and our regional specialists had to shift the work that they were doing to create and provide supports for lessons and remote learning. The challenges of remote learning for young children, including the ability for adult engagement in home settings, create significant equity issues, which are a great concern in Denver. We found that more structure was needed to support both teachers and families, and have made shifts in guidance and supports for teachers. We know that relationships and establishing touch points for families has been key. So in addition to providing the technology and the lessons to families, it's through relationship that we've been able to support the success of this operation. Supporting adults in this space is what we have identified as a key goal. As we discovered that the adults, both our families, our teachers, our administrators, were all in such uncharted water that the comfort level had evaporated. It's become clearer and clearer that supporting adults in the early childhood space is one of the most vital actions that our department can provide. We've had to be planning for all scenarios for pre-K to 3 in the reopening of schools, as the landscape is shifting daily, or sometimes more frequently than daily. Along with the learning issues for students, there are significant funding implications as well. We surveyed all of our district staff and families regarding their return to school preferences, and the responses both from staff and families, as you might imagine, are all over the board. Families wanting complete face-to-face, hybrid models, all remote learning, with great concerns about what their children, sometimes for preschool and for kindergarten, first experience in education would be. Our online registration for kindergarten in fall of 2020 began last January. We have a choice option in Denver that's quite robust. And although I don't have exact numbers, I don't think we'll have exact numbers until school actually starts. I'm hearing about many families who have signed up, registered for kindergarten, who are now considering redshirting their kindergarten-bound children for reasons including remote learning concerns, as well as health concerns. A ripple effect is a childcare capacity issue as providers try to meet the needs of both their children who are rising kinders and their current preschoolers. Many children missed out on transition activities in spring Those events were canceled or reduced significantly. So closure to their preschool year didn't occur. Teachers will need to take the time to bridge this gap as we return to school. So that means that the focus of our professional development needs to shift, not only the platform for delivery, but especially the content. Young children need more than ever to have their emotional needs addressed in order to be able to access the learning opportunities that we're providing. Most elementary school principals have a less than robust understanding of early childhood principles. We're working to build capacity within the school leadership teams so they're able to provide the support for teachers in meeting children's needs. Ongoing PD is contingent on relationships that we establish with students, parents, families, and community. In creating a sustainable structure for psychologically safe communication, learning, discussion, and collegial exchange ideas, our executive director, Priscilla Hopkins, recognized that it was critical to create an open channel for the dissemination of information to our teachers in a timely manner. Transparency about what's known and what isn't allows people to have access to information directly, rather than relying on the fast-flying rumors that are generated when there is silence. So we've established bi-weekly regional meetings led by regional specialists that feature breakout spaces so that groups of teachers can share and learn from one another. We found that our teachers, in all of their striving to provide what their children needed, were floundering in wondering what was happening at a central level. So these special meetings that we've started this summer have given them a much more solid footing as we plan for reopening schools. Priscilla is also hosting monthly ECE department and DPS district staff meetings with breakout spaces for input. Teachers and other staff need to be heard. They need to know they have a voice in this process. If they are feeling more comfortable, all of our learning opportunities for children will be more successful. Fostering collaboration between community sites and district-run programming is really very important. Due to the ever-shifting nature of this virus, it's been difficult to finalize decisions, making it challenging to identify our next steps, which impacts families, teachers, building administrators, community, and childcare providers. Because of our strong partnership and collaboration with our community providers, I was able to set up visits at sites that had remained open throughout the pandemic when the district leadership wanted to hear about their lessons learned. I was able to bring central staff into sites for interviews with directors. They shared their experiences, the challenges, the changes in policy and procedures that created safe environments for staff and children. The information has been extremely valuable in designing what procedures and protocols are needed in the reopening of our schools. You could go to the next slide, please. So this is required that we pivot and reset to support our educators in the creation of quality learning opportunities for young children in our new normal. Looking at the different ways that we engage educators and families. Relationships are more vital than ever. They're key. And many of our teachers have discovered that because of remote learning, there were opportunities created for authentic communication with families that actually strengthened those relationships. In some cases, where there really hadn't been much back and forth communication, families found that they needed the guidance and support of teachers to be successful in supporting their children's learning and reached out to them. And teachers realized how much families could do in the support of children's learning at home. So we really had a lot of expression of surprise and pleasure, actually, at being able to communicate with families in an authentic way that hadn't existed previously. Everyone is in new territory, and recognition of the humanness of us all can build a sense of community. One of the stories that I heard was one of our teachers who made and sent face masks to all the kids in her class. What a touch point. What a way for a family to recognize that that teacher genuinely cares for their child. The strengthening of these relationships between teachers and families is one of the silver linings in this unusual time. Creating open channels for regular back and forth communication, even when the communication is, we don't know the answer, we'll keep you posted, supports people in feeling connected. Feeling that you have a voice and are being heard is vitally important. Removing the barriers in the flow of information so that people feel they're involved in the conversation has made a big difference in the levels of engagement that we've been able to achieve. It's important to provide a space and time for people to work together, discuss problems of practice, and learn about what's working and not working instead of being in a vacuum and everyone trying to find their way on their own. It's so important to know that we're not in this alone. Even if we're doing this virtually, relationships in schools, with families, and between colleagues, along with leaders' relationships with teachers, are key to staying connected and being a community. There's one thing we've learned through this pandemic. It is how important it is for us to think in terms of community as opposed to individuals. We've needed to develop ways to establish new sense of normalcy. This is such an unusual time. Many of the things that we need to do for children to have smooth transitions are the same. Everyone is working to adapt delivery of those same actions to continue to provide supports through the new virtual space that we're in. Plans that we have for transitions to support families and strengthen alignment between our community sites and district schools have morphed. They've had to morph. We've produced interactive PD trainings, webinars for transitions, remote assessment supports, and how-to video on YouTube for sharing social stories. And soon to be released is a 4-part series of podcasts in English and Spanish on kindergarten readiness. Our early child community in Denver has over time been a strong collaborative force. These relationships have become even stronger through this period as we've worked together, and we can't drop the ball now. We need to be creative in our thinking and willing to take new challenges. Our decisions need to be coming from our desire to find solutions and not be mired in fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That was a typical Jane ending, is to end on a hopeful note, despite all of the challenges. So we now have time to answer any questions from the chat box. I'm going to start with one that has already come in, which is both Jane and Andrea mentioned the role of childcare providers assuming the role of working with children on remote learning assignments. And so how has this been navigated between and among schools, families, and childcare providers? So maybe Andrea, will start with you, and then Jane, and then Lauren, we'll see if you have something you want to chime in with as well.
So in Connecticut, it was primarily the schools that were doing remote instruction. If the community-based providers were doing it, it was at their discretion, but there was a requirement for any of the school-based programs to provide that remote instruction. What we wanted to make sure for our youngest learners is that there was an understanding that distance learning for young children does not look like distance learning for middle school and high school students or even upper elementary. So what I did with one of my colleagues at the Office of Early Childhood was we produced a video, and we did it in 2 versions. We did a version about distance learning for educators, and we gave them some resources and tools. And we also did a version for families, because one of the things that we found out that was sort of an aha moment for me when I was on a call with my sister-in-law who has 4 young children was that there are so many competing things happening. And when we're talking about young children, a lot of it has to do with their interactions with whoever their parent or caregiver is. And our function is more of a coaching model with the caregiver or the parent. And it's not just setting up a camera someplace and doing live instruction and having a bunch of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds sort of sit in front of their computers. So we really had to come up with strategies that, one, made it okay for families to do what they needed to do and that they shouldn't feel badly about it, and how to incorporate learning experiences into everyday learning activities so our teachers could then help with the remote learning of coaching those families.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Jane?
So with our community providers, when our district classrooms closed, actually went on an extended spring break the middle of March, most of our childcare agencies who we contract with in the district also closed. However, about 9 of them stayed open throughout. And even when we went into remote learning, they remained open and were serving the first responders and essential workers, children, who were part of their population already. But they found that many children weren't coming, that families were concerned about bringing them back. So they did go to a hybrid model on their own. One site in particular that provided not only face-to-face learning, but in their remote learning model, they brought the children who had been in their classrooms in with the children who were still in the classrooms. So they maintained that community of learners by bringing them in virtually, at least for part of the day. And they did remote learning as part of the classroom. And then they also provided for families opportunities for them to support children's learning at home by sending lesson plans and often materials. We also have some initiatives in Denver that are working to support families through our Early Childhood Council that have provided materials for families to implement remote learning at home. They have materials, supplies, and as well as some of the just basic things that families have needed, including food, of course.
Great. Lauren, do you want to weigh in on this one?
The only thing that I would also add on this kind of global state level here is that we had the scenario of our school age or children or population of children who would have typically been in a school setting merging into our child cares. And we also did see that fluctuation in families and children attending childcare as we served essential workers and then had childcare reopen. We saw that in the setting of spring and summer, but now as we look forward to fall in Texas, as eligible 4-year-olds are in statute for full day pre-K and thus generate ADA funding, we are needing to and waiting for clarity from the federal office on how we can and if we can, what those options are for funding when it comes to child care subsidies and financial assistance from our subsidy programs for children who are eligible and should be in a full day public pre-K or public education setting. So we're starting to see that it is generating some different scenarios that none of us have necessarily needed to navigate through. And so we're needing some of those kind of higher guidance on how we navigate through that, which will then in turn, if they are placed in a childcare setting, help to support some of that remote learning. So we are, although waiting for that guidance, trying to plan ahead in how can we connect some of the initiatives at the education agency, like this instructional continuity and remote learning resources. How can we connect those to our childcare programs just to prepare them should some of those children actually be enrolled in their childcare settings?
Great.
So I would just like to add to that a little bit. Colorado Department of Education has come out with guidance on remote learning, not just for districts, but for any recipient of uh, CPP funding, Colorado Preschool Program funding. And what it requires, and this question has come up from our community sites, should they choose to be remote, what would be the requirements for funding? And there's a pretty robust plan for remote learning that needs to be in place, along with accountability. How do we keep attendance? How do we make sure that the accurate number of hours is being tracked? That's both for in-district and for community agencies. And then for those agencies in the city that are not part of Colorado Preschool Program, our district council has provided strong supports, both for business operations and for remote learning supports.
Great, thank you, Jane. I do just want to chime in here because I'm hearing it in a number of conversations that I'm in, is that, so what Jane just described in terms of community providers using state-funded pre-K dollars, there's some guidance. But we do know through child care development funds, those families and children that are eligible for child care subsidies, there is a federal law that prohibits CDF dollars for instruction. And so this is actually not just a guidance from state agencies. This is a need.
I believe Christy froze. Is anybody else frozen?
Christy's frozen.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it just may be her.
Okay.
Maybe her.
I will, as we wait for her to come back on, and she finished out that sentence, there's, or thought, there's another question in the chat that I think I can start us off with. What types of assessments, if any, are planned for students in the K-2 grades upon reentry, whether in person or virtually, to get a sense of learning loss? It's a fabulous question, and one I'd love to jump on and start. We actually just discussed this today. So in Texas, our K-2 will have their required beginning of year progress monitoring that will look at language and literacy for the most part. But then in addition, the Commissioner of Education has requested that are in our first grade level, that within 20 days of the school year starting, they will have a dyslexia screener administered to help to determine potential learning loss or learning challenges, and be able to start to provide some instructional support there. Our vendors who own those assessments on the Commissioner's list of assessments here in Texas have provided professional development and technical support to our agencies, our local school districts, excuse me, to be able to help support our teachers and administrators in providing and administering those assessments virtually, if that is the case for them.
So in Connecticut, I don't have information yet about specific assessments, but something I would like to add is our commissioner has made it very clear that upon students' return to school, to face-to-face learning, that the priority is social and emotional, that children have likely experienced some kinds of trauma, many of them have experienced trauma, that there is going to be an adjustment period back to school. And he has made it extremely clear that that is our first priority when kiddos get back to school, is to make sure that they're okay.
And in Denver, I have not heard much talk about assessment. I mean, we are looking for what progress indicators we will be watching, but I don't know what specific assessments will be used. I know in early childhood and for our entering kinders that we'll continue to use our ongoing Teaching Strategies Gold assessments, but at a state level, I'm not sure what the requirements are going to be. As you said, Andrea, the big concern right now is getting back into programming and having children feel safe, secure, nurtured. and hopefully joyful in their learning.
I think it'll definitely be interesting to see what states report, not only report in assessments utilized, but also report in that learning loss.
True, and that being said, coming with that IDEA lens, we know that there hasn't been any waiver of any requirements of IDEA, so we're still going to have to do our early childhood outcomes entry data for any child that is new coming in with an IEP. So even with the SEL requirements, people are going to have to dive right in and during the first 4 weeks of school complete those assessments.
Great addition. We also have another question here where internet connections can be challenging, i.e. in rural areas or those without access for some caregivers and families. How has engagement with this population been addressed? So I'll start us off here in Texas. It came from a, not necessarily an executive order, but a kind of press release from our governor's office that was in conjunction with our Health and Human Service Agency, as well as our Texas Education Agency, on this COVID-19 support of instructional continuity planning. And this instructional continuity planning is twofold. One is to provide internet access, and the other is to provide device and access to devices should children and families need for all of our grade levels. So that includes pre-K through to 12th grade. And the way in which the state is addressing rural areas or those without access is they are using the education service centers or regional service centers across the state and tasking them at that kind of more regional local level of collaborating with and kind of incorporating all of those local agencies, education agencies and school districts within their region on how to best address the needs of that community. Because obviously a need in a very urban city like Austin or Dallas is going to be very different than even El Paso or the Gulf Coast. So looking to those regional offices to help to determine what those individual community needs would be.
And I guess I've told Lauren this many times that every time I hear her speak, I just think about how lucky I am and stop complaining about my 169 dog catchers in Connecticut compared to what she has in Texas. But because we're so small in Connecticut, we don't have some of the coverage issues that there may be in other states because we are pretty well covered in our state and we don't have any really large rural areas. We do have quiet, we call them the quiet corners of the state, but even those quiet corners, to the best of my knowledge, still have broadband access. What we did have issues with were devices, and Connecticut was really fortunate to be able to partner with philanthropy, and was given a large amount of financing to be able to get devices into the hands of students, especially in those large urban centers where we found that there were many students who didn't have access to devices. So it really has been a collaborative effort.
So this is Christy, I'm back. Clearly, even if you have broadband access, it's not always reliable or consistent. So these issues are real for, I think, many. We have just a few minutes left, and so I wanted to see if there are any final questions from participants. If not, I have one last round robin question that I'll put on the table. Okay, so my last question that I'd love to hear each of you spend a minute reflecting on is, what do you know now that you wished you'd known 6 months ago? In other words, what sort of systems would you have in place that would have been making this time easier? And what are the possibilities of reimagining your system moving forward to embrace those pieces? Who wants to go first?
Sure, I'm unmuted, so I guess I can. So one of the things I wish I had known, and I guess I sort of always did know it, but the roosters didn't come home to roost until this pandemic, was that in a Department of Education that often sees itself as a K-12 agency, that pushing that agenda to say we are a pre-K-12 agency and making sure our academic office and all of our other offices don't overlook all of our 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, and just by way of a strategy, the way I did get the notice was I made sure the right people knew that there are almost 19,000 young children in Connecticut that receive services through public schools in preschool. So I think being able to make sure that the agency has a good understanding from the begin, all the way through, starting in preschool, because I think we do a good job with connecting with our partners that are responsible for birth to 5, but the actual state agency doesn't always remember our youngest learners. And I wished I had pushed the issue, not that I haven't been a NAG for, over a decade, but I wish I had pushed the issue further with the right people.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Jane or Laura? Lauren?
I'll go. So many things on different levels that have become apparent in this time over the last almost 5 months. One is the adaptability and amazing resilience of so many of our care providers. And something that I hear from many people is that through staying open and staying engaged, they had the staff who participated in that are more grounded and comfortable in this unusual time than those who have isolated and not had that sense of normalcy, even though it's a different normalcy. And I think that that's key to our connectivity and the importance of our connectivity. So whether we are doing that virtually by making sure we have intentional communication going on between providers and families, between administration and staff and families, that connection is just kind of a linchpin to keeping us grounded and moving forward. And the adaptability of our internal staff in thinking outside the box to continue to provide supports both for families and children has been astounding. So we're just going to keep pushing the edges.
Great, thank you, Jane. Lauren, I'll give you the last word, and then Matt, I'll toss it to you to wrap up the session.
Great, thank you. And I would say mine is not necessarily a new thing that I've learned, but it's kind of affirmation that when we look to the work that we do, we are often, or do often refer to ourselves as change agents, right? Systems integrators, systems thinkers, and really pushing that status quo. And often that is pushed back on us with quite a bit of reserve or difficulty and hesitation. And I think what we have proved and reaffirmed within ourselves, both within the state of Texas and across other states, in the work that we do, is that we truly can make those big changes and do it in a very quick turnaround and be very successful at it in some of these initiatives and projects that we have been able to stand up. So thanks, Kristen.
Thank you, Lauren, and we appreciate you jumping in and acting as a moderator for us there too when Christy was frozen. And thank you also to Jane and Andrea for your comments. So this kind of wraps day one. We're going to be convening tomorrow again at 1 Eastern for a conversation with Tabitha Roscoe, who's the 2020 National Teacher of the Year and the first pre-K teacher to win that award. And our second session tomorrow is a look at how family engagement is being redefined in the pandemic. So we all hope that you enjoyed today, found it useful, and will join us again tomorrow. And we'll be following up with resources from the presentations at some point at the close of the sessions. So stay safe, and we will see you all tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.